It is my pleasure to welcome you to our second Fulbright Forum of the 2010 program year. Every December, I find myself anticipating the season's first heavy snowfall. As rooftops and storefronts become part of a monochromatic tableau of a surface and defined edges, I'm reminded of Korean unique architectural structures and the sense of uniformity that a cloud of sparkling white can bring. I hope you have an opportunity to enjoy the season's rare and fleeting beauty. And I thank you all so much for braving the cold in order to be with us this evening. Tonight we gather in support of 2009 junior researcher Evan Ho. Evan received a bachelor's degree in architecture from University of Minnesota before moving to Japan, where he worked with several architectural firms prior to the start of his Fulbright grant in Korea. His presentation entitled Discerning Principle of Architectures in Seoul will focus on the development of new cities and how modern professionals are remolding urban environments in Korea. Through his research, Evan has created an alternative proposal for modern development that is based on the analysis of existing Korean urbanity, a proposal that he will share with all of us this evening. Following tonight's forum presentation, we hope that you will join us on the third floor for a light reception. Our staff has prepared some refreshment for you to enjoy as we continue our discussion of urban architecture in Korea. After the lecture presentation by Evan, you're going to have a Q&A session, and please don't take too long for your Q&A because you have to enjoy your reception too. And now, without my further comment, please join me in welcoming 2009 junior researcher Evan Ho.
Thank you, Mrs. Shim.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody at the Fulbright. The last year and a half, I actually came here in September of 2009 on the CLIA, the Extended Language Training Program. So I've been here 15 months now, and this is the last month of my research. The Fulbright program has been really excellent the whole time, so thank you everyone for all your help. Yes, so I am going to present now. First of all, when coming to Seoul, like my first time coming to Seoul, I had no idea what to expect. It was in 2008, and I still remember the evening when I was driving in a bus from the airport into Seoul, and I just saw all these sort of apartments coming at me, and I felt really sort of scared about what was going on. Coming from Japan and America, I'd never seen anything quite like this before. This is kind of my first impression of Seoul. This is Gundam. This is an aerial photo of Gundam. And about 50% of people in Korea live in kind of these apartment buildings. And they're very simple rules for establishing this kind of apartment building, based on a few modernist architects from the 1920s who kind of established this rule of green and light being able to penetrate through into every apartment complex. Le Corbusier came up with a city that looks immaculately similar to this in the 1920s, and it has become a model since the end of the Korean War for generating city and architectural form in the Korean landscape. Even in the last yes. So even in the last 30 years, there's been an extreme amount of development. Even now, as you'll see from some slides that I'll show you in a little bit, there's a tremendous amount of development going on. This is the same neighborhood in 1983 filled with Hanuks, and then the neighborhood again in 2005. And even since 2005, this neighborhood has drastically changed. There are almost no wooden structures remaining. So this is Seoul in 1948 as a map that the U.S. military created. And you can see it's extremely limited in sort of the oranges, the yellow, the brownish color is the concentration of mostly wooden dwellings. And this is 1948. And then here is 2005. They're in between maps, of course. I don't have much time. The city has grown tremendously in the last 60 years to the point where some architects, including my instructor Lee Jung-ho at the Korean National University of Arts, has termed this sort of hyper-development as a hyperpolis, is what he calls this process of developing so fast that it's not even really possible to influence what's happening in the design. So these are 5 architects that I've been working with pretty closely in the last year and a half, actually. Lee Jung-ho, like I said, is my professor at the Korean National University of Arts, who kind of has been guiding my project. And these are kind of the 4 other architects here are 4 other architects that I've met along my research and my process of trying to find these architectural principles in Seoul. They include Park Chang-myan of Sai Architects, Choi Moon-gyu of Ga Architects, Marco Bruno, who's Italian, of Modo Elastico, and then Paek Ji-won of Urban Tainer. And I think these are pretty much as diverse of a set of architects that I could find. I'm just going to give you a few quotes from these architects that I've interviewed briefly to just kind of introduce you to their character a little bit. I asked Lee Jung-ho if he was nostalgic about how much Seoul has changed in his lifetime. Lee Jung-ho is about 61 years old. He's the oldest of the architects that I have been working with, and he worked at Space Architects, which is kind of the central core architecture community here. So he's kind of the older, more established architect. And he says, sometimes I am fundamental about the architecture in Seoul. However, I love evolutionary change of the city landscape. I love the memories and the history of Seoul, but we have to change. We have to embrace this change and make the next state in this evolutionary change of the city. He has 2 notable buildings, and he always tries to kind of make them a temporary structure or put them underground. So he doesn't make these sort of evolutionary buildings as much as his quote would lead to. Paek Ji-won is a very young architect. He's only 35, but he won the Architects Award for Seoul last year, so he's very successful. And his actually is the most interesting quote, in my opinion. Like I said, the name of his firm is Urban Tainer, and I asked him to explain that a little bit. And he said there's kind of like the spiritual that successful architecture creates. And it's not so much about the building, but it's more about how the building is inhabited with the people. So this is a quote that I translated. Different projects gather different architectural projects gather different flavors of culture from different parts of the city. For example, if there's a restaurant that has really well-made bowls, for the food. However, if the chef does not know what he is doing and fills the bowls with poor quality food, no one will come back to the restaurant. The same is true for my architecture. I wish to see it being occupied, for people to be meeting, feel comfortable, and to have a good time. So again, like Lee Jong-il, Baek Ji-won has this sort of sense of temporariness in his architecture, where it's more about the spirit inside than the physical building and connections himself. Marco Bruno is an Italian architect, but he's been here for 8 years with another Italian architect that he started this firm with. And I asked him, he renovated a hanok, and they made it more contemporary, and they dug out the basement and made it a contemporary livable hanok, not strictly based on the traditional ways of making the hanok that a lot of the remaining hanoks are required to follow by the government. So, basically, I'm going to paraphrase this. If you want to put a kimchi refrigerator inside of your hanok, or a television, or a jacuzzi, it's not designed to do that. When hanoks were made, they were made for people that did not have a lot of money and were living a very simple life. So if you go by those standards now and you want to live in a hanok, you kind of have to live like you were a monk. And what he did when he redesigned this hanok is he made it more contemporary. Choi Moon-gyu is a very prominent architect here, and he uses typical concrete instead of the more expensive high-quality concrete when making exposed concrete structures, the one where you can actually see the formwork of the building. It's usually covered up in Korea, but he leaves all this exposed. And he uses just typical contractors instead of extremely expensive contractors that most architects would use. And I asked him about why most of the buildings in Korea are concrete and they don't use a lot of steel connections or wood connections. And he said that I don't believe that building contemporary Korean architecture today should literally be mimicking or copying based on how traditional Korean structures were made. I believe that a Korean architecture is based on Korean building industry in Korea. Concrete is cheap. We have good workers compared to China. It's much cheaper to build than in Japan. And compared with the States, we have better workers and it's cheaper to build. He studied in both Japan and America, so he kind of has this travel through all of these places. And then finally, this architect really influenced my final project, which I'll get to in a minute. Actually, I'll talk about Park Changyeon in a minute. So this is my first sort of architectural principle, basically a filter I used to when I was walking around or researching projects to kind of understand them a little bit more. And in Korea, there seems to be projects that aren't necessarily concerned with preserving any sense of history or any sense of architectural value, such as these new towns or shindoshi, these new cities that are being established, and they tend to erase everything and start with something completely new that's not based on what was existing. So I call this a sort of social separation from what was existing on the left side of erasing architecture. On the right, there's this idea of refining a sort of style or a method. For example, with Choi Moon-gyu, he was refining a style of using concrete that was specific to Korean and Korean builders and the materials that are inexpensive in Korea. So I would say that would be on the right side of the sort of social integration of erasing architecture. And then we have to have the making architecture. I'm going to get to this really briefly. In terms of a good quality of building, a building with spirit, you have to have a good structure, and you have to have a really good relation to the location, the site, and then finally, you have to have a good program to go within. So these three things, the structure, what's going on inside, and where the location of it are extremely important. And when these things are kind of brought together properly, you have a really amazing building. And that's integrated with the city. And finally, my third principle is the Hwang-gi principle. Hwang-gi is a contemporary artist, and he made paintings with dots. And each dot is individual from the one before it and the one after it. And I retraced one of his paintings while studying city planning for the first time in my life. I wasn't familiar with city planning, so I found it similar to retracing this painting. But while retracing it, I learned that there's a system and there are certain rules for making the system, yet each individual dot has a unique quality. And this is kind of one of my filters I looked at when trying to understand the city. And this is the process of tracing the dots that I made. It took about 20 hours to get through this. And then I have 3 discoveries. We just went through the 3 principles, and then I have 3 discoveries that, not discoveries for like architecture as a whole, but discoveries that I made along my travel, my journey through Korea, that really influenced how I understood Korean architecture. And the first one is the stairwell. Each and every individual stair in the stairwell was unique from the one before it and the one after it. And I realized that the contractors that went into this building, that I found, their job was to make stairs in between the floor plates that existed. But that was really the only rule that they had. And they made a really unique condition, similar to how every dot is unique on the Hwanggi painting. I also went to Jeju and worked on a hanok for a week, and I really learned a lot about each piece of wood in the hanok has a name, and the connections, there are no nails, and even though this hanok that you see in the photo on the bottom, it doesn't have any rocks on it, but it's a standalone wooden structure, but it's set down lower into the earth because the hanok is in Jeju where the climate's warmer, and it is covered with rocks on the outside, but it's a separate structure, so it's not a stereotonic structure that's based on these heavy rocks, but it's actually a freestanding wooden structure. So I learned a lot here, and then finally my 3rd discovery was with Park Chang-myan. Again, he made this installation based on the poet Yi Sang and his works, and this was extremely influential to how I approached these new cities in Korea. So at the Korean National University of Arts, the Graduate School of Architecture switched its name to the Graduate School of Urban Architecture. So over the past 5 years, Yi Jung-ho and his research lab and his graduate students have been studying Seoul in its entirety. And this year, they break it down to systems. 1 year they studied the Han River, 1 year they studied line number 2, and this year the topic was new cities, Shindoshi. So we studied Shindoshi for 4 months, and then we proposed a piece of a Shindoshi for 4 more months. So this was a project that I adapted into part of my Fulbright thesis here. Currently, if you go to Naver or Daum and you look at the maps, there are these things that I call dashed line cities, and there are current projects that are undergoing that erase essentially everything on the land and flatten it and add infrastructure and build apartment buildings or some sort of highly planned Shindoshi or new town. These are all current construction projects that are going on right now. The biggest one on the bottom left, the colors aren't coming up very well. The biggest one on the bottom left is Incheon, and they have a complete city there. I don't know if anyone's been able to travel there, but it's completely empty, and it's full of skyscrapers. So if you get a chance, you should check it out. It's really interesting, but I'm not really sure how that will work out. Am I allowed to show these photos here? These are proposed plans. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Ilsan on the right. Ilsan Shindoshi is on the right, which is kind of here. This is Ilsan. This is the Hangang, the Han River. and then this is essentially Seoul here. So this big red box was our site for a new city. And these are a few programmatic drawings that a city planning company put together for the site. And the yellow would be apartments, the orange would be villas or like 5 or 6 story G-Techs, and the water is blue, and the white are the roads that go through, the green are the green. It's kind of a similar proposal here. So these are 3 proposals that the government kind of put together. This is Paju City, right north of this proposal, north of Ilsan. And this is a photo I took about 5 months ago. And quite literally, they take everything out of the context, which is mostly rice paddies and little towns in the country, and kind of build these massive developments. You can kind of see the tree lying there, and this is a school bus. I'm not really sure where it's coming from or where it's going, but this is the same site. On the right, you can kind of see the context that was existing, and on the left, you can kind of see what's being constructed. This is the same location. These are all empty right now. And this is right outside of our school, the Korean National University of Arts. This is sort of how this context feels when you're inside of it. It's quite an amazing thing. People just kind of walk around, you can bump into them and start a conversation. It's nice. And then here's Wangshimni, which has been completely erased in the last year. Actually, every building in this on the right has been destroyed, and it's a big pile of dirt at the moment. This is a particular building in Wangshimni. I did not take any of these photos or make any of these drawings. They're from an architecture firm called Guga, and one of my associates at the Korean National University of Arts, Huisong. This is an old abandoned factory building on the left, and what happened is 5 or 6 families moved into this factory building, and they started making their houses there. So they made these hanoks inside an old factory building with just kind of pieces that they had gathered, and they're not architects. They just had an experience of seeing buildings being built by their parents or by family, and they went into this abandoned area over the past 40, 50 years and kind of generated these amazing buildings. So this is sort of a paradigm, I think, in Korean architecture, to realize that not everything needs to be 100% planned or fabricated, that there's the ability for people to kind of make their own environments and to comprehend the city and change the way they want to live and create that spirit on their own. So again, this is the site I just showed you with the planned location to west of Ilsan. It's kind of hard to see in this photo, sorry. But these are just some of the conditions, the houses that exist there now. They're kind of on the higher ground, the clusters of homes. There's this grid of rice paddies that water kind of flows through. And here's a bird sanctuary. In the middle, there's a Paju publishing city. This is kind of where all of Ilsan drains into the river, and where all the toilets from Ilsan kind of go and get filtered before going back into the river. The land in this proposed city, again, Ilsan and to the west, is all very low, so there's nothing really stopping the area from being flooded if the river gets high, which it does increase every year. But the people living on these sites kind of have these methods for dealing with this. On the left, there's a photo of a building, but they built it 3 or 4 meters up off the ground, so when there are a lot of rains, the rice paddies fill up, and there's water right next to these homes and factories. So when we came into the site, we had to choose how we're going to treat it for our new city proposal. So we thought about these sort of flooding situations for a long time. I'm just going to show you a quick video of this sort of rice paddies. These are the different levels of rice paddies and how intricate they are. And when you can kind of contrast this illustration with the plans that the city planners are putting on top of this land, it completely destroys this whole network of agriculture, which is quite beautiful. It's not pure nature, obviously. It's agriculture that has been modified for a cash crop, essentially the rice crop. But this is our proposal for the new city, this gray piece along the river to kind of fortify this city against the water, because there's a large dam, and if that breaks, we're kind of fortifying this dense city. So our proposal for placing in a city was along this stretch here. And then what we were trying to do is raise off the ground with our proposal. Let me put this here. So here is, I'll get back to that. On the bottom, this is a flood that happened in 1991 on the site, where the levee kind of broke and the whole site was underwater for about a couple days. So there has been floods on the site. So our idea at this point was to lift these sort of agriculture off the ground and to put these housing units underneath and allow light to continue to reach the agriculture that's existing, to keep everything existing on the ground, and to kind of build a city up off the ground. So that's the end of my dashed line city proposal. And this is the beginning of the Yisan city project, which is on the same piece of land. This is the same project sort of developed further. Well, who is Yisang? Yisang is a modernist poet, essayist, fiction writer, and architect, born as Kim Hae-kyung and in Jongro-gu, and in Seoul on September 23rd, 1910, the same year that Korea was annexed by Japan as a colony. At age 19, he graduated from Gyeongsong School of Industry, completing his second education, and was employed at the Japanese Government General Office as an architect. He was frequently published in the Journal of Architecture, Joseon, and Architecture, and carried his designs, drawings, and poetry. So essentially, the dashed line circles that you see are the research of this sort of cultural idea, this sort of infrastructure, and the location of our proposed site, filtered through some of the poetry of Yisang, and finally, at the end, we created this sort of city form. So essentially what I'm proposing with this project is not creating a city based on we should put apartments here and a new river here and a business district here. I'm proposing that I'm proposing that there's a city based on the modernist works of a Korean poet that are, I'll explain that in a second. So Yisang's poetry, many people think of Yisang as a poet and not an architect, but Yisang was one of the first Koreans to begin defining modern Korean architectural forms. He was trained as an architect, and the way he writes his poetry is very solid and physical. So these architects, the following architects and researchers are relating Yisang's literature at the moment to his architectural world. So there's lots of really new literature on how Yisang was this sort of architectural thinker. So why am I using Yisang to make a new city? So we need these spatial rules for a city plan that are flexible, and we need a diverse system for making a city that can change over time, and we should recall the first forms of Korean modernism defined by Isang, and somehow using poetry and allowing many people to understand, well, what is the city to me? Somehow using poetry makes the city more personal, I think, than having one master planner draw up a city and hand it to the developer, who hands it to the companies who make the buildings. It seems more personal to have people individually define what they want their city to be. So these are six models that I generated based on 6 poems that Yisang wrote. And I'm going to explain these models quickly, individually, and briefly show how I interpret that into a city. So this is the same plot of land. The Han River is the bluish-gray line on the bottom, and then the sort of flooding it's labeled is right above that. And these are the 6 poems and where I put them into the land. So I literally, these are the steps that I went through to kind of make the poems physical. I went through and I read the poems and I took out rules that Yisang defined, and which are quite physical, and started making physical models that are 30 by 30 by 30 centimeters with a certain type of foam board. So I gave myself rules for interpreting his poetry, and kind of used his rules, and together we made these sculptural models. So I'm just going to walk through these. And as I was kind of generating these models, not necessarily thinking about the land initially, there are certain forms that sort of came out that resembled things I'd seen in the city or things that I experienced here in Korea. And what I did is I brought those qualities back into the land. So this poem in particular is the most dense of the architectural poems. Has anyone read this poem? Maybe I... Oh, okay. Sorry. Maybe I can... How are you doing on time? Okay. I can read the poem later. I have it in English as well. Why don't I read the poem? Okay, I don't have that sheet in front of me. Essentially, at the beginning of the poem, he writes out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0, and then he writes it horizontal and vertically, and then fills in 100 dots, and then he goes to say that you should throw away the number, and he starts kind of speaking about the sort of speed of light and how thought can be even faster than the speed of light. So essentially I took the rules that he gave out in the order that he gave them out, and the first was this grid of dots. So I started with a grid of 100 points on my piece of model. And then one of the other rules was the sort of X, Y, and Z. So although he gives a two-dimensional, essentially plan, an architectural plan of these dots, he's kind of implying that these dots are extruded into columns. And there are a few other researchers that would agree with this. So the grid is kind of like this. I'm not sure if you can see this either, where there are 100 points, And for each point on the left, there's another diagram where there are 18 possibilities for the column to come out of that one point. So for each of the 100 points, there are 18 random positions where I can place the column on the grid. And then what I did is I extruded these points upwards and then connected the columns horizontally for bracing. So the model as a whole is very structural. And if you were able to follow one point and work up through the system, it's kind of symbolic of throwing away the number. So I could speak about these poems for a while. There are certain systems for this, for all 6 of the poems that I have interpreted into these models. And then what I did is I drew them on the computer and I started going in kind of through the models and experiencing the densities and like how the model feels on the inside and around it and the qualities of the model in different scales. And I equated these with sort of experiences or things I witnessed in the architecture in Seoul. And I kind of brought these into the land of our site. So here are the plans of the models kind of filled on the site as I placed them. And then I worked in section of these models, kind of putting in infrastructure, putting in buildings, sort of essentially populating these structural models with program in the site to kind of see how they interacted. I started mixing models with each other. Essentially, they're not just models, they're sort of these structural rules. This is an exercise for putting program in the models where the yellow would be residence. So you can't see the color, so I won't talk about that. And this is kind of the general feeling of this exercise that I did. And essentially, the city that I put together, obviously it's not a real city. It's an exercise that I kind of did with Isang that I'm promoting, that maybe everyone could individually do this exercise and kind of define their own city based on their own interpretation of the poetry instead of making this really hardly defined city plan, that everyone can kind of have their own understanding of what this city should be. And Isang Doshi actually is the Korean for Isang City, and it means utopia. I'm not trying to make a utopia. In Korean, Isang Doshi actually literally means utopia. So this is the city kind of populated, and this is the end of my presentation for today. Question?
I'm Professor M.M. Goel. I teach here at the Graduate School of International Area Studies, Hankook University of Foreign Studies. And I have a special objective of coming here to listen to you,
Yes.
architecture.
Yes.
Because in India these days we have a beautiful city, Chandigarh. Chandigarh was basically conceived by Le Corbusier and a beautiful city. And these days 19-story buildings are coming up, like in Seoul. And the people of Chandigarh are opposing that. I although feel that there's nothing wrong with the skyrocketing buildings, but the people are objecting to that because they consider that city beautiful, like you have mentioned the poetry. The poetry people, they say that it is to be done at places where there is not multi-story building. Personally, I feel that land is basically meant for agriculture and it is not to be used for housing. For housing, we should use minimum land. And I approve that multi-story building and the kind of architecture you have talked about. I want that you should make a statement that how to prevail upon the Indian people not to oppose the multi-story buildings like we have in Seoul. I want to seek a categorical statement how to motivate the people that let them accept the multi-story buildings in Chandigarh.
Right. No, I agree. There's really no way to stop these multi-story buildings from coming together, but the methods that are used in Seoul are kind of destructive towards culture, I feel, up to this point. And I've asked all the architects that I've interviewed, do you think this is going to continue where they'll tear down entire neighborhoods and destroy entire sectors of the earth and build these new cities all in 5 or 10 years? And they say, no, this is not going to continue. What's going to happen is things are going to start to happen on a smaller scale. It's not going to be districts that are destroyed, but it'll be maybe 20 or 30 houses at a time that are slowly regenerated and turned into tall buildings. And I completely agree with you that agriculture should be kind of preserved. This city that I'm promoting at the end is a little bit of a paradox. I don't believe that this city should actually be built. As you see here, it's actually kind of demonstrating that a culture such as Korea can find their own idea of modernism that's not based on Le Corbusier. So, nice. Any other questions? Yes.
Hi. My question is also related to a professor from India. Could you enlighten us a bit about we talked about the human factors, but this sort of thing is going everywhere in Shanghai, Beijing, Hong Kong, it could be Taipei. And I wonder how, in Korean context, how they compensate the farmers, the villagers, and the millions of people who are displaced. Do they get to live in these high-rises? Or do they have some kind of, extra privilege to get pangchong, or cheaper housing? And how does the Chaebol Consol, Kiop, the Hyundai, the LG, the Lotte Castle, all of these people, how do they contract these architects, and what is the exact relations between the architectural firms, the designers, as well as the building and government investment? It's a long question, sorry.
Okay, for the last part of the question, I think these large construction companies are not often consulting architects in many cases. Yeah,
They don't have their own architects.
They have architects, but they're not necessarily trained in the way that architects are in the West. They're kind of taken right out of military school, out of architecture school, and then they kind of go into these large construction companies. And they're not necessarily consulting the sort of Western idea of an architecture firm. It's more based on infrastructure, from what I understand.
So they have a model of Lotte Castle, and then they just build it everywhere, like Busan. They just take it prefab and just.
Essentially, there's certain engineering rules where an engineer can kind of build without an architect in many cases. Although this is changing a lot. I mean, architects are starting to get involved with these projects, from what I understand. In terms of compensating people who are moving, who their land is being taken from them, from what I've been told, when a neighborhood is told that it's the end, like they're going to construct there, it gets really tense, and people raise the prices of their houses until a number of them get sold. So they just start selling immediately once they say that a certain district is going to be sold, unless there's enough lawsuits to compensate them for enough money that they would be able to live in the new apartments that they build there. But once that number gets to 70% sold, which is the best time to sell it, right? 65 or 70% of the buildings in the district sold. 70% is the cutoff line. That means once 70% of the buildings are owned by the construction company, they all go. So then you don't get a good price if you're in the 80th percentile or the 90th percentile. And they don't get compensated. I think most of the people move away once it gets redeveloped, their land, because they can't afford to live in the apartments that are built there.
But this is a sad phenomenon going on around all the big cities in Asia. They all start to look alike, right? They are.
I think it's slowing down here, though, in Korea. I think it's.
Wasn't the design, like an international design, didn't Seoul host a big, I mean, I feel like, isn't it trying to change its image towards being more like design oriented? Well, there was,
Oh.
it's design year
She's-
2010.
Oh yeah, no,
Yeah.
there's a lot of
Yeah, like
design.
what is happening? Like what is the sort of,
Oh, you mean the UNESCO Design Creative City Network that Seoul became a member of?
yeah, I mean, was that random or is there
Random.
some like intention?
There are really good things happening in Seoul. I mean, it's an amazing place for architecture.
Oh,
There is this huge sort of. Did I get the impression that everything's going really poorly? No, this is actually a really good place. There are just sort of these big machines that are now starting to collapse. But up to this hyper development has made these large developments that are quite scary. But there's a lot of really amazing design going on here in Seoul. So I don't know. I don't
It's
think-
starting, or it's, I mean, where do we see the, you might not have the eye for it. I know when I see these bird's eye views, they look like bird's eye views of cemeteries. Tombstone after tombstone after tombstone. You know, these apartment complexes.
So I think that's a Western view. Actually, I interviewed one of the architects that he trained in Japan for a year under Toyo Ito. He graduated from Columbia, and he builds these beautiful buildings that are very light and amazing program, and they're working really well. In Anguk Station, where you walk up into the building that wraps around, and it's kind of a little strip mall. It's really popular. He designed that, and I was surprised to hear that he actually lives in an apartment, and he commutes in a car. You know, their family, they're happy to live there, and he has this huge knowledge base of all this stuff. I don't know. I think it's just a standard in Korea where you buy an apartment, and that's a status kind of thing. And I don't think any of the apartments are necessarily permanent. They're sort of an investment, and in 30 years, I believe most of them probably will be gone, actually. Or I'm hoping. Any other questions? Yes.
I have a question about the ESA project. It seems really interesting, and could you expand more about like to what extent is the alternative for what like Korean urbanity we have now, and how it's like keeps the distinct Korean quality, like traditional style.
Yeah, I think if I presented this to someone like an official city planner or someone in government, they would probably be very confused and start laughing at me. So I don't know if it's a realistic approach to a city, but there's this concept that everyone has their own city, like what they believe to be their city. Like Choi Moon-gyu, one of the architects I interviewed, he kind of talked about everyone has their own city of points that are connected. Like you're at home and you go to work, and in between you go to restaurants, and it kind of makes this constellation where everyone's able to kind of make their own city. And for some people, they don't necessarily see the apartment buildings from the air and if they're beautiful or not. It's their city where they go home at night after it's dark, and they go to sleep, and then they get in their car and they go to work, and they don't necessarily need to critique the architectural form. So this idea of utopia, that everyone kind of has their own city, is sort of what I wanted to say, I guess. Yeah. I think, yes.
Well, I teach business at another university here in Seoul, but I'm looking at the presentation. I'm sure you presented, of course, it's the principle of architectural design. It seems to focus on the architectural basis of buildings and so on, but I think, like somebody mentioned, in the Western perception or other issues, or like other Asian countries that you mentioned, I think part of it is, when policy is made as to how a city is going to look like you mentioned, your school program to change to urban architecture as opposed to whatever it was before. Part of that has to do with, I think, the beginning to try to have people involvement,
Exactly.
What it had. Because I saw a documentary not too long ago about Japan, talking about suicide rate, people getting a lot of stress, and there's no more nature type environment anymore, and that have some kind of impact on the psychology and behavior and so on. So basically, I think you know, you have to look at it from different dimensions, which is beyond your reach here, in a sense, you know, the political implication, the cultural, the social, you know, and of course, there's lack of space in some of these places. So I guess you have to consider the population is growing, but where are they going to live at? You know, 10 feet down the ground or up in the sky. So all these things have to be considered, I suppose. So I think you know, the beauty is there. I think you know, how you can marry that with nature, culture, and retaining some of those things, things that, you know, some of the issues that are raised here. It's more like a statement as opposed to a solution to anything. But
Exactly.
it's beautiful the way it's presented, I suppose, and it makes a lot of sense as to why things are going.
Yes, maybe the final question, I'm not sure. Yes?
I wonder if you could elaborate on your methodology a bit more in terms of, I understand how you situated these 5 architects and you talked about your selection process, but I'm curious the way that you refer to other modernist artists and the way that you selected or contextualized Monkey or Yusang as a poet. Can you talk a little bit about how you see the movements and work across forms speaking to each other? Well, like, for example, why that poet? Why that one painting? Why? And why not look at other, for example, contemporary artists or other work, especially artists that really engage production of landscape?
In terms of Yusang, I was really looking for the kind of first idea of Korean modernism. There are lots of architects that are always looking for the first idea, like the beginning, the volume 0, like before volume 1. So with Yusang, I saw his poetry and his ideas as not as Japanese and not necessarily as completely Western, although he was very educated, but as very Korean and then very early in the terms of a Korean modernization. But actually, the true answer to your question is the architects and the works and the modern artists that I've used are the ones I sort of ran into on my travels, and these are the ones that kind of stuck with me. I can't explain how I met like Yusang or Kim Hong-gi in the first sort of circumstance, but it's sort of what was in front of me and what I had to do to make my next presentation at school in that process. So it's sort of in a way, it's my personal travel through how I was trying to interpret this project. But yeah, that's my answer. Okay. And then also some interpretations of the poems as well as models are going to be published in Acta Koreana, the ACTA Koreana in the next publication. So look for that. Okay, thank you.